Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Coronado, in your testimony, you said something I completely agree with. You said that diagnosing the drivers of inflation is key to crafting a response to it. And you've answered a couple of questions about this already. I was interested in explaining why the United States has a substantially higher inflation rate than other countries. You said that you thought that deficit government spending, including the American Rescue Plan, was not even close to being the predominant cause. Several weeks ago, the San Francisco branch of the Federal Reserve issued a report in which they were investigating why the United States has a higher interest rate, higher inflation rate than other countries, and they reached the opposite conclusion. They concluded that deficit government spending here, in particular the American Rescue Plan, was the predominant cause of why inflation was higher here than in other countries. Have you read that report, and do you disagree with it?
I am familiar with that report, and since the data that was used for that report, we've seen a pretty marked acceleration in core inflation across other countries. So in some senses, that finding is stale.
Okay, now that sounds like we're talking apples and oranges here. They were talking about why last year the United States had higher inflation than other countries.
Correct.
And you're saying it doesn't matter now because everyone has high inflation.
Well, we
got out ahead.
We have to keep learning about the from the incoming data, and what we're seeing is that there is a considerable rise in inflation across countries. As you saw some of these charts that have been presented, there sometimes is a lag between when things happen. And what we've seen is that a lot of this supply chain inflation, other countries, because their recoveries were delayed, the U.S. recovery was strong and early. Other recoveries was delayed. So as that spending came forward, you did start to see that supply chain inflation take hold too. So I'm not one to say it had no impact. There is an impact. And there's also a benefit. There's a cost and a benefit to providing very strong support. So I'm not saying there's no impact or there isn't a meaningful cause in the wedge. The wedge that I estimate now is, maybe a percentage point.
Well, let's talk about it worldwide then.
Mm-hmm.
So, the WTO has been looking at the same issue, from a worldwide perspective, not just a U.S.-centric perspective. And Robert Koopman, who's the chief economist of the WTO, has estimated that he says 2/3 and 3/4 of supply shortages worldwide are a result of excess demand resulting from government spending. So do you agree or disagree with that?
So I do. There's more, I put more weight on the first part of that and less on the second part of that. So remember, a very key development in the pandemic globally was the shift to goods spending over services spending. So that's unprecedented. We have not seen that kind of shift in consumer spending in our lifetimes ever since actually the last time we saw this kind of shift was World War II.
Sure, but the WTO is saying that as a result of all of this excess money being injected into worldwide economies.
So that's the part that I take more issue with.
Okay, well, so you disagree with the Federal Reserve, you disagree with the WTO. The CBO, well, you know what, we're not going to get into that.
The Federal Reserve is a big system with hundreds of economists, all of which have an opinion. So I agree with the Federal Reserve and disagree with the Federal Reserve, depending on the analyst we're talking about.
I understand, but I think that, and this isn't a question, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that majority of economists now would acknowledge that government spending has played a substantial role, if not the predominant role, in catalyzing the growth of inflation. This leads me to my last question, which I'll go to Ms. Parrott. And this is, it's been an interesting hearing. We've got these two ideas in tension, which is what Dr. Coronado was just talking about. The fact that the American Rescue Plan undoubtedly catalyzed this round of inflation. We can argue about how much, but undoubtedly contributed to it, if not caused it. And you've testified that the American Rescue Plan was, what you said, the most substantial anti-poverty legislation since 1935. So, here's the question was it worth it? Was this round of inflation that's leading to interest rate hikes the Fed is meeting today, was it worth that, that result for the good that the legislation did?
So I think you set up a false counterfactual. So, right, the American Rescue Plan helped strengthen the recovery, reduced unemployment, lots more people working. I agree with Dr. Coronado. I think I wouldn't say that it had no effect on inflation, but I do think we would be facing high inflation today, regardless of whether we had the American Rescue Plan. But I also think that in the absence of the American Rescue Plan, we would have had more kids in poverty. We would have seen a spike in evictions. We would have seen a lot of people struggling. And so I'm not going to speak to a false counterfactual that I don't think is accurate. But what I will say is that the American Rescue Plan made an enormous difference in the lives of tens of millions of people and in communities across the country.
All right. Well, I see that I'm out of time. It's an interesting discussion, but here is, what really depresses me about this argument is that, you also have to consider the effects of inflation on the impoverished here in America. And it's been said that inflation is one of the most regressive taxes because it disproportionately affects the people who can least afford to pay for it.